Great, thank you so much for this invitation and the kind introduction. It is a pleasure indeed to be here. My talk will, as you'll see, immediately pick up on some of the themes from John's, but in a very different register in so much, and I may be the outlier in this panel because artificial darkness is really meant, and this talk derives from the forthcoming book, artificial darkness is meant to decouple darkness from nature, from night, from chiaroscuro, from metaphor, from evil, from subconscious, from all of the connotations with which we associate darkness and have for a good number of millennia. This talk is in three parts. The first two derive from or adapted from the introduction of the book. The last part derives from the coda, so there might be a bit of jumping around. It's a very long history. I provide a bit of an overview to start and then jump to the present. The book's really about the late 19th, early 20th century, but there's a coda on the present, and I thought it might be appropriate to end this talk thinking about the afterlives of artificial darkness in our own time. Without further ado, let's get going. In the beginning, the biblical beginning, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. All cosmogonies begin in formless darkness. Creations commence with the creation of light. Without form, darkness was the void, the nothing, from which God created ex nihilo. The proliferation of gods in the Greek pantheon enhanced the status of darkness only nominally. The personification of darkness, Erebus, deep darkness, shadow, was the son of the primordial god Chaos. Formless, void, chaos, nothing. The status of darkness changed little in the centuries that separated the mythical beginnings of the cosmos from the disciplinary beginnings of art history. Alois Riegel, a turn-of-the-century curator of textiles at the Imperial and Royal Austrian Museum for Art and Industry, the lecturer extraordinarius at the University of Vienna, and a founding father of the discipline of art history. Riegel embraced objects, techniques, and epochs neglected or repressed by his emergent field. Yet even for Riegel, absolute darkness marked a boundary. In his path-breaking analysis of Rembrandt's chiaroscuro, the dramatic rendering of light and shadow, which he disarmingly translated as spatial darkness, Raumdunkel, Riegel identified the limits beyond which no art history could proceed. I quote, "This spatial darkness is not absolute darkness, for then it would simply be nothing, not even space." For Riegel, and anything that went by the name of art history, absolute darkness was a limit, a joke. The joke was notoriously told by the poet Paul Bilhaud, a member of Les Arts Incohérents, the incoherent arts, a satirical art movement now most famous for its anticipation of sundry avant-garde techniques, not least monochrome painting. On August 2nd, 1882, Jules Lévy organized the first presentation of the Incoherence, followed 2 months later by an exhibition at his Parisian home. Infamously, Lévy exhibited a black monochrome by Bilhaud entitled "Negroes Fighting in a Cellar at Night." I hope we don't laugh too eagerly. The French writer and humorist Alphonse Allais elaborated on the conceit with the first communion of chlorotic young girls in the snow, apoplectic cardinals harvesting tomatoes on the shore of the Red Sea, and other monochromes dutifully collected in his April Foolish album, a portfolio of 7 monochromatic images and droll titles published in 1897. Émile Cole, a father of cinematic animation and one-time incoherent, brought the gag to the screen for the French film studio Gaumont in the summer of 1910. Titled The Neo-Impressionist Painter, but clearly derivative of the Incoherence, the film depicts an artist in his studio visited upon by an eager bourgeois collector. The artist presents one monochrome after another. Intertitles announce their content as, for example, a cardinal eating lobster and tomatoes on the shore of the Red Sea, whereupon the film cuts to a red-tinted animation in which appear said cardinal, lobster, tomatoes, and seashore. The gag is reprised with a Chinaman transporting corn on the Yellow River, a Pierrot on a pile of snow, and so on, such that witty and frequently racist intertitles precede tinted sequences of animated line drawings. The collector becomes progressively more agitated until a black monochrome sends him into a buying frenzy. The black monochrome, we are told, represents, this will sound familiar, Negroes making shoe polish in a tunnel at night. The film cuts to black leader, and in contradistinction to every other sequence, begets no animation. The screen and the auditorium remain a uniform black. Bilhoud, Allais, and Cole portioned their wit from the same commonplace stew as Riegel and Hegel. The latter famously condemned the formalism of Friedrich Schelling and others as that undifferentiated night in which, as we say, all cows are black. Hegel's jibe helps us distinguish Bilhoud's original joke from the elaborations proffered by Alphonse Allais, a distinction articulated clearly in the film by Emile Cole. Whereas all the objects in a red monochrome must be red, cardinals, tomatoes, and so forth, all cows need not, indeed, they must not be black. Red is a color, darkness is a condition. All but one monochrome in Cole's film were represented by discernible animated content tinted the appropriate colors. Only his black monochrome completely negated the image, plunged the auditorium in darkness, and turns its rows of spectators into a darkling plain of black cows. 20 years after Cole's film, and 15 years after Kazimir Malevich introduced his black square as the ponderous emblem of suprematism, the Dada surrealist Man Ray returned to the jocular black monochrome. The white mount of his 1930 black photograph bore the dedication, I'm quoting from the bottom, to Robert Deneau, the surrealist Robert Deneau, to Robert Deneau, full of things that absorb the light. A perennial prankster, Man Ray let it be known that the image was in fact a cameraless photograph, or rayograph, where objects interposed between the light source and photographic paper absorb the light and leave virginally white traces on the paper. The purported technique and handwritten dedication contradicted the image. A rayograph full of things that absorb light would be white, not black. The joke, now more technical than humorous, turns not only on the limits of representation, but also in the intricacies of darkroom technique. The trajectory charted from Bilhoud to Cole to Man Ray is instructive. In less than 50 years, a witticism about darkness became a spectatorial reality, and then an avant-garde quip embedded in specific media techniques. An affront to representation became a calculated deployment of real darkness, and finally, an image that braided darkness into avant-garde practice. The history of artificial darkness adumbrates a similar trajectory. Only rather than follow amusing content, it elaborates a multivalent technology and aesthetic strategy. For where Bilhoud saw a one-liner, 19th and early 20th century physiologists, entertainers, architects, photographers, cinematographers, and artists recognized a technology of darkness. And where Bilhoud and his ilk produced black paintings for laughs, film pioneers like Georges Méliès and avant-garde artists like Oskar Schlemmer developed technologized darkness into an art form. I'll have to leave Méliès and Schlemmer for another occasion. Instead, here is my primary thesis in very short. Darkness has a history and a uniquely modern form. Ancients and early moderns alike knew darkness as chaos and absence, night and shadow, evil gods and melancholic thoughts, the color or non-color black. They knew darkness principally as negation. Moderns mobilized artificial light to conquer the night, disenchant the night, and create new media and art. The dark corners untouched by artificial light retain the qualities of ancient darkness, whatever its modern labels, Gothic, sublime, unconscious, uncanny. This much is well known. Less familiar, but no less vital, is the history of artificial darkness. Modern artificial darkness negated the negative qualities ascribed to its timeless counterpart. Divorced from nature and metaphor, highly controlled and circumscribed, it was a technology that fused humans and images. More precisely, controlled artificial darkness negated space, disciplined bodies, and suspended corporeality in favor of the production and reception of images. In the middle of the 19th century, physiologists cleaved blackness from darkness. Inventors patented photographic darkrooms, and impresarios extinguished the lights in their theaters. By the late 19th century, darkness was controlled in a series of complementary sites, above all, dark theaters and the velvet light traps known as black screens. These sites for the production and reception of images formed circuits of darkness that helped shape modern art, media, and their subjects. This is the second section, and it picks up from this year 1882, where the incoherence exhibited the black monochrome. And I'm going to look specifically at two sites of artificial darkness, Wagner and Marais, or Marais and Wagner, science and spectacular opera from the mid to late 19th century, and argue that these are the complementary darknesses that help us think a long history of artificial darkness, which unfortunately I won't be able to elaborate here. In order to interrogate artificial darkness, we must not ask what it is, but rather where. Artificial darkness was inextricably linked to a series of sites for the production and reception of images. At the precise moment the incoherence made ancient darkness the butt of an art joke, two revolutionary sites consolidated the power of modern darkness. In the months between the inaugural presentation and formal exhibition of the incoherence, just a few miles west from the home of Jules Lévy, a laboratory or physiological station was erected in the Bois de Boulogne for France's leading physiologist, Étienne Jules Marais. Among ingenious contraptions and devices of all kinds stood a dark, empty shed. Marais marshaled the absolute black produced by the shed in order to facilitate photography on a single plate. To prevent the plate from clouding despite scores of exposures, Marais photographed opposite the large aperture of the shed, the interior of which he painted black and lined with black velvet. The dark shed rigorously divorced light from darkness and entertained no chiaroscuro. This giant velvet light trap, and this is about a 10-meter deep trap, so it appears two-dimensional, but it's important to remember that it's actually 10 meters deep. We just can't see into its depths. This giant velvet light trap ensured that little to no sunlight reflected back to the camera, except from those objects such as seagulls, soldiers, and scientists who flew, marched, and jumped before the dark face of the deep shed. Objects clad in black and placed before the black shed vanished, but for their suits' stick figure traces. Marais made these multiplied, you see them here. Marais made these multiplied traces famous under the rubric of chronophotography, a designation that resonated perfectly with Richard Wagner's contemporaneous pronouncement, "Time here becomes space." Less famously, Marais labeled them cinematic analysis. And this is 1882, long before the so-called invention of cinema. Unlike the nothingness of cosmogonies, Marais' black screen was a fully formed void, a darkness that was something. In one respect alone did the art historian Riegel's dictum hold. Marais' absolute darkness was not even space. In contrast to the bright sunlight that surrounded it, the impenetrably deep darkness appeared like a two-dimensional surface. Marais dubbed it l'écran noir, the black screen. While Marais perfected the black screen and Lévy collected absurdist black monochromes, Richard Wagner consecrated his festival theater at Bayreuth. The July 26, 1882 premiere of Parsifal was described by Wagner as his Bühnenweihfestspiel, or festival play for the consecration of the stage. In the history of artificial darkness, the music of Parsifal was incidental. Instead, it was, quote, the revolutionary darkness of the Festspielhaus, as media theorist Friedrich Kittler proclaimed, to which all the darknesses of our cinemas date back. The darkness of the cinema, christened Wagnerian darkness at the turn of the century, was a second instance alongside Marais' black screen in which absolute darkness was something formed, not a formless nothing. The absolute dark theater was no less crucial to the experience of cinema than was the luminous moving image. A generation after Riegel championed chiaroscuro as spatial darkness, Raumdunkel, Rudolf Harms, an art historian turned media philosopher, disarmingly identified the conditions that presided over cinema interiors, that is, the condition similar to the condition here, although it's a little bit too light in the auditorium, the condition that presided over the interiors of cinema during a projection he described as spaceless darkness, raumloses Dunkel. So instead of Riegel's designation of chiaroscuro as Raumdunkel, spatial darkness, Harms describes the interior of cinemas during a projection as Raumloses Dunkel, spaceless darkness. As all moviegoers know, when the lights are extinguished, we do not remain in the dark, but rather forget the confines of our environment and project ourselves into the film. As averred by the surrealist poet and cinephile Robert Deneau, in the perfect night of cinema, the room and the spectators disappear. Cited, imitated, and amplified across the globe, Wagner's darkened theater and Marais' black screen were the paradigmatic sites of controlled darkness in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But they were in no way site-specific. Bayreuth and the physiological station were at most metonyms for dispositifs of artificial darkness soon reproduced the world over with nearly identical results. Indeed, the specificity of these two sites lay partly in their capacity to negate sight along with space. Black screens and dark theaters could be erected anywhere, but they were most effective when erected in tandem. Wagner's Festspielhaus codified the darkened auditorium and autonomous luminous screen as the dominant mode of theatrical and cinematic spectatorship. Marais established the principal configuration and nomenclature for the black screen, a rectangular wall of darkness in a luminous environment. Each ensemble epitomized the strict separation of light and darkness that came to be known as absolute black or absolute darkness. At its core, the relationship between black screens and cinema was one of dialectical inversion. Their respective darknesses were not contiguous, but reversed. An early caricature, and this is my own reconstruction, but imagine this whole screen now as a giant caricature, or rather imagine it as a miniature caricature. An early caricature of Wagner's Festspielhaus, of the interior of Wagner's Festspielhaus, establishes the basic terms. A white rectangle placed just above the center of a larger black rectangle carried the caption, "Orchestral Rehearsal in Bayreuth." If you knew more about Bayreuth, this would be hilariously funny, but allow me to explain. The joke pointed primarily to the invisible orchestra, and the orchestra, which is sunken in a pit so that it's no longer visible, means that when there's an Orchestraprobe, or a orchestral rehearsal, you see nothing but the luminous stage. In other words, all you see is a luminous rectangle in an otherwise totally dark environment. And remember that the dark opera house was a relatively new, or at least new standardized phenomenon when Wagner introduces it to Bayreuth in 1876. The joke pointed primarily to the invisible orchestra, but also of necessity to the immersive darkness and luminous stage for which Bayreuth had become infamous. One can hardly imagine an autonomous luminous screen of attraction represented more economically. And yet the real joke, its underlying structure and animating impulse, was that the dispositif of artificial darkness exceeded representation. A luminous screen in spaceless darkness was little more than a white rectangle on a black rectangle. Bayreuth's autonomous luminous screen, and for that matter, cinema's autonomous luminous screen, was a precise dialectical inversion of Maret's physiological station. And now I'm condensing a very long argument into a very short few sentences, so bear with me. Whereas the cinema was a luminous rectangle in an artificially darkened space, the black screen was a perfectly dark rectangle in a naturally luminous environment. Whereas the cinema screen produced the illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface, the black screen produced the illusion of a two-dimensional surface from an impenetrably deep three-dimensional space. Finally, whereas the cinematic spectator was extinguished so that the luminous image could reign, the object of cinematic analysis vanished before the black screen only to reemerge as a graphic image. And think back now to this image, which is not a stick drawing, but an actual photograph of a figure dressed all in black, except for metallic bands running along his extremities. The dispositif of artificial darkness comprised black screens and white screens whose constituent components could be reversed so long as they remained strictly separated. Absolute black, in its physiological or technological manifestations, was incommensurable with total darkness, whether an illusion produced by contrast effects, as asserted by 19th century physiologists, or an instrument of astonishing precision to overcome deceptive appearances, to borrow a phrase from Maret. Absolute black required the emphatic presence and strict delineation of both light and darkness. But in the decades of its discursive and technical emergence, absolute black was always doubled. The dispositif of artificial darkness was constituted in complementary and inverted dispositions of absolute black, as an autonomous screen and as an immersive environment. Maret and Wagner, black screen and invisible orchestra, cinematic analysis and cinematic architecture. The dispositif of artificial darkness comprised two halves that attained totality only through separation. Structurally inverted, these darknesses performed a reciprocal set of operations linked to a series of fundamental reversals in the history of art and media. I'm going to enumerate four of them. First, the dark theater and black screen prioritized darkness over light. More precisely, they initiated the strict circumscription of darkness in place of the interpenetration of light and shadow, known as chiaroscuro. And it's important that there's been great work, extensive work on the history of artificial light. There's also more recently been some wonderful work, we're about to hear an instance of it, on the history of night. But there is, to my knowledge, virtually no work on the history of artificial darkness. The idea that darkness itself can be construed as a product of the same Enlightenment prerogatives that produced artificial light and technology. Second, the sites for the production and receptions of images, what I'm calling the dispositif after a number of recent and older theorists, the sites of production and reception of images gained parity with or even primacy over the individual images produced and received. Wagner's sets were mired in 19th century mise-en-scène. His theatrical revolution was architectural, not scenic. Similarly, Maret employed his black screen to produce scientific images, but the same procedures proved at least as effective in the production of stage illusions, photographic and cinematic tricks, and abstract dance, to cite just three of many examples. In the orbit of artificial darkness, the most successful images did not interrogate their own intrinsic qualities. Rather, they exploited their relations to the dark sites of their production and reception. Item number one, a shift from light to darkness. Item number two, a shift from images to the sites of their production and reception. Item number three, the primary procedures carried out at Bayreuth and at the physiological station were functions of invisibility, rather visibility. Indeed, the visibility of the stage for Wagner, or of minute movements for Maret, hinged largely on operations of invisibility. Subjects disappeared within Wagnerian darkness and before the black screen. And you see here a very early chronophotograph where you're looking at the black shed, the so-called black screen, but only a section of it is actually lined with black velvet. So on the very far right, you can see a ladder and other bric-a-brac that's stored in the shed. And in the dead center, you can see the section hung with black velvet. There and only there is the figure dressed in black with these metallic strips, visible as a walking, living stick figure. But if you look to the right and to the left of that, you can see the faintest ghostly traces of that same figure. Right? Crucial here is Maret's technology his technology of darkness, in order to make these subtle, minute movements visible, had to make the human figure invisible. Indeed, the invisibility of artificial darkness helps explain how it has largely escaped detection. Finally, reversal number 4, the dark theater and black screen operated through spacelessness rather than in space. Spacelessness was a discursive trope that accompanied artificial darkness. We hear terms like spaceless darkness, spaceless stage, and spatial negation over and over again within this history. But the distinction between space and spacelessness as a product of darkness is most readily graspable in phenomenological terms. And I think it's also these terms that help us distinguish most of the discourse around night from the discourse that I'm trying to establish around artificial darkness. The sense of disembodiment and spatial dislocation familiar in the cinema and equally pronounced before the black screen is completely reversed when one is forced to grope in the pitch black. And let me just backtrack a second. When we're in the cinema, during a projection, we're almost never aware of the darkness. Not only are we not aware of the darkness, we're rarely aware of our own bodies. Not only are we not aware of our own bodies, we almost completely forget about the space in which we're in. The darkness, our bodies, and the space collude. Rather, the artificial darkness colludes to make us forget about our space and forget about our bodies. Right? To remember the quote by Robert Deneau, I should remember the quotation. In the perfect night of cinema, the room and the spectators disappear. Okay? That's the perfect night of cinema. That is the artificial darkness of cinema. It's largely the antithesis of the experience of either night or total darkness. Eugene Minkowski asserted, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty echoed, that night is pure depth without foreground or background. Night is pure depth without foreground or background. Artificial darkness, and think again of the black screen, artificial darkness, to the contrary, is pure surface without depth or space. 4 reversals punctuate the history of artificial darkness: light to darkness, image to sight, visibility to invisibility, space to spacelessness. These 4 reversals do not exhaustively map the operations of artificial darkness, but they do provide the framework in which to locate its history in relation to the more familiar histories of art and film. Unfortunately, I can't rehearse these histories in toto, so allow me to jump to the afterlife of artificial darkness in the present. And my argument is that by the 1930s or so, technologies of artificial darkness have either largely completely codified. The primary example here would be the cinema. The classical cinema has attained its modern shape definitively by that point. Or they've become largely outmoded. And the black screen, Maret's black screen, is the direct ancestor, literally, of blue screen technologies and eventually video blue and green screen technologies. So one can write, and I've written in part the history, and I'll rehearse it a tiny bit, not really today, but I'll allude to it a tiny bit today. One can trace a direct history from current green screen techniques all the way back to Maret's black screen. Last section, historical darknesses. The uniquely modern forms of darkness that are my primary focus, and they are darkrooms, cinemas, and black screens. These uniquely modern forms of darkness are now historical. Separately and in aggregate, darkrooms, cinemas, and black screens figure marginally, if at all, in the production and circulation of contemporary media images and subjects. And yet, as modern artificial darkness yields to ever more luminous and ubiquitous screens, new aesthetic and historiographic possibilities emerge. This owl of Minerva flies at dawn. Darkrooms. And I didn't have time for it today, but there's a wonderful, I try to reconstruct the history of darkrooms. Darkrooms are actually patented 2 years after the formal announcement of the invention of photography in 1839. One of the disciples of Daguerre patents the darkroom in England. And he points out that he recognizes that ruby red light, that the daguerreotype plate is insensitive to ruby red light. And he says that if you use a ruby red light, we're now able to carry out in light all of those activities which formerly we were forced to carry out in a dark room. The dark room, the photographic dark room, is named and patented at the moment of its selective illumination. Or, to cite numerous 19th century photographic manuals, what's inside the dark room isn't visual darkness, but rather obscurité chimique, chemical darkness. So this is another type of artificial darkness which I'm going to speak about for like 2 seconds, but we can, if there's interest, return to it in the Q&A. In the face of impending extinction, analog photography and film have become the subject of innumerable eulogies. Some freely announce their wistfulness, others pretend to evade the tinge of nostalgia, others still assume the defiance of the vanquished. The demise of the photographic darkroom has been treated tenderly by photographers the world over. In his aptly named book, The Disappearance of Darkness from 2013, photographer Robert Burley tells the story of an industry that was obliterated by the creative destruction of the digital age. The work presented here, he writes, is a photographic survey created in a post-photographic age. The result is a book about what photography once was as a technology, an enterprise, and an art form. Burley visited and photographed the production plants of Kodak, Agfa, Polaroid, and other multinational corporations before their closure and destruction. Before their closure or destruction. And it's remarkable here, there's a true deep nostalgia for these multinational corporations. It's a very strange affection, right, affective behavior, where multinational corporations happy to obliterate the rights of workers now become the objects of melancholic affection. Repeatedly, darkness and darkrooms came to the fore. Quote, all photography was once about darkness, both literal and figurative. No other medium was predicated on it. Darkness made photography unique. And we might remember that an early name for photography, largely abandoned, was what? Scatography, the writing of shadows. Not the writing of light, but the writing of shadows. I haven't slept for 2 nights in a row now, so you'll pardon my pauses. For Burley, the mammoth and windowless factories were, quote, the architecture of this darkness. He chronicled the scheduled implosions of film factories across the expanse of the world and the history of photography. Burley's Via Dolorosa took him from Toronto, his city of residence, to Rochester, Kodak's hometown, and on to Chalon-sur-Saône, the birthplace of photography. Here, several months before Burley's pilgrimage, Tacita Dean shot her film Kodak from 2006 on and about the quote-unquote last rolls of 16mm film. In the hands of Burley and Dean, industrial buildings and celluloid strips appear effortlessly photogenic. The quote-unquote chemical darkness housed in these buildings and requisite for these film strips, however, proved more elusive. Cinemas. The struggle to represent artificial darkness is no less pronounced in the case of cinema. And what should be obvious here is that as these early monochromes and these avant-garde jokes make clear, representing darkness is almost a contradiction in terms. The struggle to represent artificial darkness is no less pronounced in the case of cinema. nor is its afterlife any more assured. 80 years ago, the eminent art historian Erwin Panofsky could confidently write that, quote, if all the serious lyrical poets, composers, painters, and sculptors were forced by law to stop their activities, a rather small fraction of the general public would become aware of the fact, and a still smaller fraction would seriously regret it. If the same thing were to happen to the movies, the social consequences would be catastrophic, end quote. Cinema or revolution is no longer a threat or a battle cry. Like the darkroom, only more so, cinemas have been the subject of countless love letters or condolence cards in avant-garde, independent, and mainstream art and film in the last decades. We all can name any number of works. I'm going to focus on one, and you see it in front of you. Hiroshi Sugimoto's Theaters series, which he produced from 1975 to 2001, pays tribute to cinemas as well. But like the best work of this genre, to borrow an old term for a new phenomenon, they are much more than homages. For over 30 years, Sugimoto has photographed film screenings in a single hours-long exposure. As Wagner, and the idea is he goes into the movie theater, they start the film, he opens his camera, or he opens his shutter, they start the film, and at the end of the film, he closes the shutter. So what you're looking at ostensibly is a 90 or 120 minute long exposure of an actual feature film. Obviously, the frames annihilate each other until all that is left is a luminous white screen that it alone illuminates the interior of the cinema. As Wagner pronounced and Marais actualized, here time becomes space. Radiant white screens, not a prismatic unity, but rather the superimposition of every frame in the film, illuminate the opulent interiors of the interwar and mid-century film palaces that dominate the series. Critics have seen an effort to bring light into the darkness. And remember that in almost every single instance, this history is one of enlightenment, bringing light to the darkness, illuminating the darkness, disenchanting the night, and so on and so forth. Right? I'm trying to resist that enlightenment impulse. In Hans Belting's estimation, quote, it is the very room we usually occupy with our bodies, but which we tend to forget while traveling with our imagination to the sights we are shown in the movies. Sugimoto's cinema screen, according to Belting and others, illuminates the spaceless darkness it routinely helps produce. But as emblems of cinematic experience, the photographs operate in precisely the reverse manner. In Wagner's declaration on the artwork of the future, quote, the spectator translates himself upon the stage by means of all his visual and oral faculties. The public, that representative of daily life, disappears from the auditorium completely. This is Wagner's text from 1849 announcing his program for Bayreuth, which wouldn't be realized for decades. The public, that representative of daily life, disappears from the auditorium completely. We remember Robert Deneau. The hall and the spectators disappear. Sugimoto's photographs do not merely remind us of the space we tend to forget, they consummate our complete disappearance. Rather than illuminate the public, Sugimoto's screens have absorbed it. Thus, Theaters successfully represents that which has resisted representation, the spaceless darkness of the cinema, understood not merely as a physical phenomenon, but also, and more importantly, as a spectatorial condition. As a series, Theaters signposts crucial junctions in the history of movie theaters. Today, the cinematic absorption and disappearance encapsulated in Sugimoto's photographs are no less historical than the theaters named in the work's titles. The photographs, in other words, are totems of a cinematic tribe whose power waxed earlier in the century, waned in the last generation, and whose artifacts are now preserved like relics in a museum. Where my preceding discussions chronicle the origins and rise of cinematic darkness, Sugimoto's theaters and their reception plot its apex, decline, and preservation. The featured theaters generally date from the 1930s and 40s, the height of cinematic power. The series itself dates from the 1970s, the simultaneous nadir of cinematic attendance and the pinnacle of anti-cinema film theories and art movements like expanded cinema. And the photograph's immense popularity blossomed only in the last decade as the movie theater became an object of filmic preservation and art world desire, that is, of morbid fascination and necrophilic compulsion. Cinemas and their artificial darkness survive, no doubt, but they survive as relics. Black screens. At first blush, the history of black screens can be plotted along a similar trajectory. Black screens turned blue, cinema blue screens gave way to video blue and green screens. Blue and green screens migrated from video art and professional videography to everyday digital consumer devices. And I've got a number of, I think, very interesting blue, green, black screen examples, but for the sake of time, I'm limiting myself to two. And yet contemporary Polish artist Aneta Grześkowska returns to 19th century black screen technology to undo its enduring gender politics. In videos like Black from 2007, and I'm just showing you some stills. If I had more time, now I regret not showing you the videos, but you can find this online, and there's some fantastic, the videos are enchanting to the extreme, and they're using 100% 19th century technology. They're shot on video. They could have just as well been shot on film. It's 100% Mare technology and zero digital editing. In videos like Black from 2007 and Headache from 2008, Grześkowska fuses the self-dismemberment of black screens with the erotics and dreamscapes of surrealism to master her own body as image and challenge the sexual politics of both. Whereas Man Ray's black background photographs veiled female bodies to enchant their erotic appeal, and we're looking at a photograph by Man Ray from 1929, Grześkowska's videos dissolve the artist into the darkness in an unsettling overlay of self-mastery and self-objectification and sexual objectification. Polymorphia, 2008, which is the name is a mashup of Bolero and a piece by contemporary Polish composer, and the soundtrack is indeed that mashup. Would have been perfect for Sonic Axe. Why I didn't play it is beyond me. Polymorphia from 2008 is hyperbolically tensed between ornamentation and sex. Its kaleidoscope sequences, reminiscent of Busby Berkeley showgirl choreography, but desublimated in exaggerated fashion through the multiplication solely of the artist's naked body. Polymorphia raises Méliès's one-man band to a one-woman musical showstopper. As much as her male predecessors, but with a keener sense of history and gender politics, Grześkowska is at once victim and god of artificial darkness. Even as artists appropriate the black screen as a historical form of darkness, scientists and entrepreneurs have reinvented it through nanotechnology. Vertically aligned arrays, and I should say, I address mostly the technology of darkness, and I address certain 19th century histories of science and technology. I'm not really into the up-to-date technology front, so if I've blundered terribly on the nanotechnology, someone feel free to correct me. Vertically aligned arrays of single-wall carbon nanotubes, now commercially produced by Surrey Nanosystems under the trade name Vantablack, can turn virtually any surface into a nearly immaculate light trap. Vantablack absorbs so much light, 99.965% of radiation in the visible spectrum, that it negates the plastic qualities of its host and makes its 3 dimensions appear like 2. And just so that it's clear, we're looking at a crumpled piece of tinfoil, part of which has been applied with these nanotubes that absorb light so wholly that it creates an absolute black. So this black hole in the center is not a hole, and it's not flat. It's just so dark that we're not able to perceive any plasticity or 3-dimensionality. Thus, a crinkled piece of aluminum that we see before us covered in Vantablack, appears absolutely flat. No surprise that Anish Kapoor, contemporary British, Indian-born British artist, Anish Kapoor numbers among the first artists to champion the aesthetic potentials of Vantablack. And here you see an installation from the early 90s by Anish Kapoor from Documenta. On the left is this black hole, on the right is the diagram for it, and crucially it registers just like Marais' black screen, only now circular and horizontal. It registers like a two-dimensional surface. And Anish Kapoor, and I would speak about him at greater length with a little more time, Anish Kapoor, much of his oeuvre is dedicated to creating, to fusing sculpture and painting by creating three-dimensional forms that give the illusion, like Marais' black screen, of a two-dimensional surface. No surprise that Kapoor numbers among the first artists to champion the aesthetic potential of Vantablack. In an interview, he said, "So black is this, it is comparable with a black hole, and of course, it's a paint, or effectively like a paint." The oxymoronic moniker black hole paint captures perfectly the operation of this new form of artificial darkness. On the one hand, Vantablack marks a radical departure from prior iterations of the black screen. Like its predecessors, Vantablack oscillates between the illusion of two dimensions and the reality of three. The operative three dimensions, however, are not architectural or sculptural, they are nanoscopic. Vantablack traps light in a forest of vertically aligned carbon nanotubes. The trees are inconceivably tall given the diameter of the trunks, but in absolute terms, the forest canopy tops out at microscopic levels. Stated simply, Vantablack is thinner than a sheet of copy paper. It is black hole paint and no longer requires elaborate ensembles of architectural lighting and disciplined bodies. On the other hand, Vantablack returns black screens to the crossfire of state, industry, and military. Surrey Nanosystems proudly announces Vantablack as a UK company's breakthrough, and Sir Anish Kapoor, also commander of the most excellent order of the British Empire and a royal academician, wholeheartedly concurred, quote, "Of course it's British black. British black." But, of course, national patrimony is an afterthought for multinational corporations. In 1886, the magician and inventor Boitier de Colta successfully patented the black screen in Britain, a feat of real magic since the technology, which he did not invent, was already widely applied and publicized. Vantablack is a registered trademark of Surrey Nanosystems and is produced through Surrey Nanosystems' patented low-temperature carbon nanotube growth process. Vantablack will enhance the performance of countless optical instruments, especially in outer space. And it's worth noting that basically telescopes in outer space will be coated in Vantablack to reduce the ambient light, which diminishes the power of the image. That same technology was recommended for microscopes and telescopes since at least the beginning of the 19th century, and I suspect much earlier. But its most audacious applications, Vantablack's most audacious applications, will surely come from its first customer, the defense sector. Under contract with the French military, Marais and Demeny used the black screen to evaluate the correct gait of marching soldiers. With Vantablack, the military exploitation of artificial darkness will likely be more varied, direct, and lethal. The future of artificial darkness will not be nostalgia for cinemas and darkrooms, but rather new forms of cosmic and military imaging. Not timeless metaphors of death, but its often invisible reality. Above all, the success of artificial darkness will not be measured against human perception, but in relation to other advanced imaging systems. Artificial darkness in the 19th and early 20th centuries integrated human vision into complex media dispositives, darkrooms, cinemas, and black screens. Vantablack will be integrated into systems that vastly exceed human vision. Its wondrous black hole appearance, little more than a novelty or an advertising gimmick. Over the last 50 years, perhaps longer, the most significant artistic afterlife of spaceless darkness has been manifest in its dialectical inversion, light space. Most prominently, artists affiliated with light and space a loosely knit art movement founded in Southern California in the 1960s, have orchestrated installations of natural and artificial light and darkness in an effort to foreground perceptual phenomena. Doug Wheeler, Larry Bell, Maria Nordman, James Turrell, and others have fabricated immaterial walls of light or darkness comparable, at times identical, to black screens. And I just want to point out in this image, and it's this is Turrell's work either photographs perfectly or not at all, depending on your perspective. In this installation called Iltar from 1974, it's one of his very first space division works, which now undergird almost everything he does. In this installation, what we're looking at is actually a rectangle hole in the wall, which opens onto a very large second room. The lights, which are oriented toward, the two sets of lights oriented laterally toward the side walls, create a luminous haze so that the black, what is basically Marais' black screen, instead of hiding the blackness, the darkness in the screen, makes light visible as a haze in front of it. It's a rather extraordinary perceptual phenomena, which I can describe, and you can perhaps intuit from this photograph, but which otherwise is not possibly photographable. But I'm going to skip to his more recent work and try to bring this back to the geological imagination that is the subject of this festival. Yet a chasm yawns between Turrell's aesthetics and this history of artificial darkness. This gap is most palpable at Turrell's as yet unfinished magnum opus, Rodent Crater, which he began the same year, 1974, a cinder volcano in the Arizona desert into which Turrell has built chambers, pathways, and apertures for the observation of celestial and other phenomena. A 2001 interview with curator Michael Govin describes an encounter with an unnamed black screen. And just to contextualize very briefly what we're seeing, on the left is the stairway, and the aperture opens up. If you look, there's a hole in the top of this crater. So that's the hole right here. We're looking up to the sky. On the bottom right, you see precisely the hole, that aperture. And on the top right, and this is the key image, you see that same stairwell at night. And that the oval registers like a purely two-dimensional surface. And for those who know Turrell's work, you recognize this two-dimensionality. Here's the exchange between Govin and Turrell. Of course, one of the most beautiful moments of Rodent Crater is when, after climbing the main tunnel at night, walking toward a dark circle, you allow the viewer to literally pierce that circular black veil by going up a staircase and walking through that seemingly solid black ceiling into the night sky as the stars and planets begin to appear before you. Turrell. Yes, on a moonless night, because it is just absolutely black. And then you go up the staircase, and it's like going in front of the footlights of a theater stage. What was flat and black starts to dome up again, and really dome, into this beautiful universe. So this connection or journey in a small, short space is the kind of thing I always wanted to do. That's just the architecture of light into space. End quote. The existential allure of this work requires no explanation, and yet something goes missing when we chase the stars. Turrell's work aims to bind human physiology and cosmic phenomena in a union freed from the historical and political specificity of media. My project in this lecture have insisted on the historicity of darkness and the specificity of its subject and gender relations. I've attempted to identify a modernist politics devoted to the disciplined integration of subjects and image apparatuses. Accordingly, even as the dispositif of artificial darkness is by and large historical, artificial darkness may resonate with current artistic and critical ambitions, not least in their unfolding encounters with the world of art remade according to the dicta of the black box gallery. Art's newfound darkening planes cannot be insulated from past darknesses, for neither have we delivered ourselves from the fetters of artificial darkness, nor, I would argue, have we wholly spent its promise. Thank you.